For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
Russia has an extensive history of being ruled by tyrannical monarchs and vicious tyrants. From Ivan the Terrible, who massacred thousands and tortured even more, to Joseph Stalin, who killed millions in gulags, and to now with Vladimir Putin, an ex-KGB that now is essentially but not officially a dictator of Russia that constantly tries to take over the territory of neighboring countries and continues to oppress the people of Russia. Putin is not a modern-day Stalin or Mao as much as the media tries to portray him as one, and that obviously doesn't excuse anything he has done and is actively doing right now. He is still a tyrannical murderer. Putin represents perfectly what has been wrong with Russia for the past 100 years. The Russian Revolution could have been the end to this problem, but instead it came in the form of a communist revolution that was spearheaded by a delusional and close-minded revolutionary that in the end started what would result in Russia being led by even worse people than before. This problem Russia has been facing is endless tyranny. During Mikhail Gorbachev's reign, the Russian people saw the possibility of a true democracy with the many reforms the USSR had been going through in that era. In 1991, there was a coup led by communist extremists that kidnapped Gorbachev. This coup greatly diminished Gorbachev's power and essentially put the USSR in the grave, but it proved to be unsuccessful. Just months later the entire Soviet Union collapsed and Gorbachev's power completely disappeared. There was one popular statesman that would rise to power. This man was Boris Yeltsin. The Russian people dreamed of democracy, a free market economy, and even freedom of speech initially, all of which people in the West, well except for Canada, take for granted now. But none of this would happen. Yeltsin saw a massive spike in crime, with many Russian mafias popping up during this time, poverty and an over 50% decrease in Russia's GDP. So obviously he was not very popular. During his presidency, many radical reforms known as shock therapy occurred. These reforms were the main reason behind Russia's economic suffering. During this suffering, Russian oligarchs became richer, while the majority of the population became much, much poorer. After just around 2 years of Yeltsin's presidency, in 1993 the Russian parliament attempted to impeach him due to the failings of his policies, but these impeachment proceedings abruptly ended when the constitutional crisis began, where Russian army started a 2-week-long shootout in Moscow to prevent Yeltsin from falling from power. This event ended all hope the Russian people had for a truly free Russia. When Russia passed its new constitution in 1993, it gave the president greater power. Yeltsin's presidency was not only marked with corruption and economic issues, but with war. In 1994, Chechnya declared independence from Russia and a 2-year-long war began. This war killed nearly 100,000 people, mostly civilians. Russia had to withdraw from this war. This was an embarrassment for Yeltsin. In 1996, Yeltsin had to run for re-election, and without help from Russian oligarchs he very likely would have lost. In Yeltsin's second term nothing got better for Russia. Yeltsin's power was split between many people in his inner circle due to his health problems preventing him from being able to properly manage his presidency. In 1998, Russia went through a massive economic crisis. From 1998 to now, the Russian ruble has seen over a 1,400% increase in inflation. The following year, Yeltsin resigned due to his health and named an pretty unknown first deputy prime minister named Vladimir Putin. Putin was born in 1952, in St. Petersburg, then Leningrad. His mother worked long shifts in the factories and his father was a conscript in the navy. His father eventually transferred into the regular Soviet army during World War II, and was injured in combat. Putin was subjected to relentless bullying in his early childhood, which is why he started learning judo to defend himself. Later on in his life, Putin would join the KGB, a security agency of the Soviet government. Putin served as an officer in East Berlin in the 1980s and he witnessed the entirety of the collapse of the Soviet Union. During Putin's time as prime minister, Yeltsin's inner circle grew to trust him, which is why they decided to appoint him as his successor in 1999. Putin established order in Russia after the anarchy Russia had been going through with Yeltsin. Around this time there were many apartment bombings in Moscow, and just weeks into his presidency, Putin started the Second Chechen War after he accused the Chechens of being responsible. This war was controversial, helped him win the election in 2000. In the end, Russia won the war, but this ended up sparking series of Chechen terrorist attacks in major Russian cities. Putin ended up putting the responsibility of preventing these terrorist attacks in the hands of the FSB, a security agency founded during Yeltsin's presidency. Putin now began suppressing any political opposition to preserve his power, increasing military spending, confiscating wealth of Russian oligarchs, and overreached the Kremlin's control over media. Many journalists or politicians who criticized Putin were now found dead. Many of these deaths lead straight to Russian mafias or the FSB being responsible. After Putin's second term ended in 2008, as he was limited to 2 consecutive terms, he appointed a loyal prime minister, Dmitry Medvedev, who saw Russia through the Great Recession. In 2012, Putin became president again, and as soon as his third term began, opposition challenged the results and claimed they were illegitimate. Putin having a third term is not unconstitutional, contrary to what most people think in the West. The Russian constitution that is in place today was created during Yeltsin's presidency to ensure the president operates above all branches of the government, and serves to enable broad presidential power. Putin is exactly what the Russian constitution was meant to create, a strong and constitutional dictator. The Constitution of Russia has been holding back democracy since it was created. It effectively ruined any chance the Russian people had for simply living in a place where they could exercise basic human rights. And what has Putin used the power given to him by this constitution? He uses it to exert Russia's power on its weaker neighbors and to stay constantly at odds with Western nations. The countries of Eastern Europe have felt the brunt of Russia's power. It is patently clear. He has been trying to restore buffer zones with NATO and to prevent the spread of the United States or NATO's influence. Putin's foreign policy and military actions with neighboring countries have started a quieter, yet deadlier Cold War. Putin has been using military action to preserve Russia's interests since the Russo-Georgian War in 2008. Putin waged this war with mostly non-combat efforts, using cyber warfare among other irregular efforts. Georgia has had over 20% of its territory quietly occupied by Russia for decades, with Russia inciting many rebellions against the Georgian government, eventually leading to a large part of its territory, South Ossetia, declaring independence. The Russian Federation immediately recognized South Ossetia's independence. In February of 2014, Putin launched a military campaign against Ukraine in response to the ousting of the pro-Russian president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. A lot of the fighting happened in Crimea. Crimea eventually declared independence from Ukraine and Russia recognized them, and then promptly annexed the entirety of Crimea in March that year. Russia argues this annexation was desired by the Crimeans due to a vote being held in Crimea regarding whether or not they wanted to join Russia. This vote was largely in favor of joining Russia, but it most likely was illegitimate. Many Russians believed that Crimea was without a doubt a part of Russia. This is because former Soviet Premier, Nikita Khrushchev transferred Crimea from the Russian SSR to the Ukrainian SSR to strengthen bonds between the two Soviet republics. None of that justifies this conflict in the slightest, but it does provide an explanation to why it began. The Russo-Ukrainian conflict absolutely destroyed Russia's relationship with Western nations. After the 2016 election, Russia's tensions with the West erupted as many American politicians accused Russia of colluding in the election. The then President Donald Trump had various meetings with Putin to ease tensions, which in the end framed Trump as being an ally of Putin in the eyes of many Americans. Prior to the 2016 election in America, Russia had become militarily involved in the Syrian civil war. Russia was supportive of Syria's President Bashar al-Assad. The Assad regime had continually used chemical weapons on civilians suspected of being against the Syrian government. In response, President Trump authorized an airstrike on a Syrian airbase to stop the chemical attacks. These airstrikes ended up killing some Russian soldiers in Syria, which brought tensions between Russia and the United States to a much higher level. For the following years, Russia's tensions with Ukraine continued to rise. Unfortunately, people do not know why Russia is at odds with Ukraine. In 2013, the then Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, was not a favorable leader in the eyes of the Ukrainians at that time. The last straw for the Ukrainians was when Yanukovych rejected an EU trade deal that put closer ties between the EU and Ukraine. Instead, Yanukovych took a $15 billion bailout from Russia. Large protests began in Kyiv. These protests eventually forced Yanukovych to step down in 2014 and he fled to Russia. This event actually ended up helping Putin get closer to his goal. The east of Ukraine was filled with many Russian-speaking people that were sympathetic to Yanukovych. They felt completely separate from the rest of Ukraine after Yanukovych was driven out of Ukraine. This situation is what sparked Russia's annexation of Crimea. The ousting of Yanukovych sparked a large rebellion in a region of Ukraine called the Donbas. The Donbas was home to the majority of Ukraine's Russian-speaking population. Not too long after the rebellions began, Russia recognized the independence of the Donbas separatist states Luhansk and Donetsk. Initially, the Ukrainian government didn't authorize a complete offensive against the Donbas separatists, but in the summer of 2014 a Malaysian airline flight that carried 298 people by rebels in Donetsk was shot down. Ukrainian forces began an offensive to fight off the rebels in the Donbas. This offensive was very successful for Ukrainian forces, with the rebels being pushed back. This is when the Russian military got involved in the conflict again. Russian forces pushed through the Donbas to fight against Ukrainian forces and to aid the rebels in the Donbas. Peace talks with the West began around this time, which led to the Minsk Accords. The Minsk Accords stated that there would be a ceasefire, elections in the Donbas, and a complete withdrawal of Russian forces. This was agreed upon in 2014. Since the Minsk Accords, Russo-Ukrainian relations have not improved. To preserve its sovereignty, after the Russo-Ukrainian conflict in 2014, Ukraine has sought out to the West for allies in the EU and NATO. This goes completely against Putin's plan to maintain buffer states between Russia and NATO. Ukraine attempting to join NATO exacerbated tensions with Russia, and it all came to a breaking point about 8 years after the Minsk Accords in 2022 with the declaration of the Russo-Ukrainian War. Russia invaded Ukraine through Crimea, the Donbas and Belarus. Now that I am talking about a far more current event, please be aware that some of the things I talk about will be in the past and not necessarily the current state of the conflict. At the beginning of the war, the front along the Ukrainian border with Belarus would be very important. This is because just south of that border is Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, which most people used to refer to as Kiev, the Russian pronunciation, but after this conflict began, many people in the West began to use the Ukrainian pronunciation. Anyway, Belarus is a completely landlocked nation of just under 10 million people. The leader of Belarus is literally a self-proclaimed dictator that is responsible for a large amount of human rights violations. The causing of a large immigrant crisis on the Belarusian-Polish border is the reason why Belarus remains one of the most corrupt nations on earth, and why the people of Belarus live in an authoritarian police state. His name is Viktor Lukashenko, and over the years he and Vladimir Putin have maintained close relations between Russia and Belarus. Belarus is Russia's closest ally. The reason why Lukashenko is so amicable to Russia is because if they weren't, it is highly likely Russia would just annex Belarus, since they have no allies to preserve their independence due to Lukashenko's hostility to Belarus neighbors, especially Poland. Belarus ties with Russia has been critical in the Russo-Ukrainian war because Belarus allows Russian forces to invade Ukraine through Belarusian territory. Russian forces quickly advanced through Ukraine and saw a rapid advancement to Kyiv, but once they neared the capital, Russian forces met staunch resistance by the Ukrainian forces. The Russo-Ukrainian war resulted in a plethora of sanctions from Western countries and the sending of a variety of aircraft and other materials to aid Ukraine. Poland has been a key importer of Ukrainian aid. This war has raised gas prices across the world and proven to be a good distraction from the COVID pandemic, and even more of a distraction from the insurgency in South Ossetia in Western media. The Russo-Ukrainian war is the first drawn-out conflict between any European power since World War II, and it's the largest ongoing war in the world as of 2022. Around the time Ukraine had won the first Battle of Kyiv, Russia called for a ceasefire, and then 2 Ukrainian hospitals were bombed. The airstrikes on Ukrainian cities like Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa have been devastating. Many civilians have died, some of which were Russian Ukrainians. Putin's plan is to make Ukraine a puppet. He will not end the war until he is absolutely sure the Ukrainian government will be in submission to Russia like Belarus. Current Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, has said repeatedly that if Russia stops invading, Ukraine will not join NATO or the EU, yet the war continues. In early March of 2022, the badass President Zelensky of Ukraine showed the UN evidence of Russian war crimes in Ukraine to attempt to make the UN send any sort of aid to Ukraine. The UN rejected this plea for aid, even though many Western nations began to accuse Russian forces of war crimes, and the current US President Joe Biden officially called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. This war has hardened the Ukrainian people, especially those who are serving in the Ukrainian military. Many videos depicting the conflict have surfaced. One video shows Ukrainian soldiers defiantly defending Snake Island by refusing to surrender to a Russian warship. Another shows a video of a Ukrainian soldier calling a dead Russian soldier's girlfriend from his phone that was recovered from the scattered remains of his corpse to nastily taunt her and to tell her how her boyfriend died. Videos of Ukrainian civilians being fired on by Russian soldiers on the highway, a Russian tank being perceived by Ukrainian forces as friendly, which resulted in the expected outcome. This war is without a doubt the most horrendous conflict of the decade, and in my opinion, I don't really see it ending anytime soon, but I hope I am completely wrong, and I hope Ukraine defeats Russian forces with minimal casualties. Ukraine is important to both the West and the East, and for the world. The best outcome is for Ukraine to either remain independent but as a buffer, or to join NATO or the EU. If Russia tries to spread its influence to the rest of Europe, it will result in a catastrophic war, and Ukraine being a Western ally or a neutral buffer is the only thing preventing that. As long as Russia is controlled by someone like Putin, Eastern Europe is potentially in a great amount of danger. Regardless, this war has to end peacefully to end the horrific casualties, but that is not likely until Putin gets what he wants or is stopped. This conflict has changed the shape of the world forever. Germany, a mostly pacifist state, has now begun increasing their military spending to a one-time budget of over $110 billion to quickly develop their military, and after that their military will take 2% of their GDP. Meaning the German military will receive nearly $80 billion per year, per real-life lore. This makes the German military the third best funded in the entire world, even ahead the Russian military, which means Germany and Russia will be in direct competition for the foreseeable future. Germany is even sending weapons to Ukraine, and they ended the Nord Stream project to prevent Russia from exporting oil to European countries. Now the EU will be forced into becoming more oil independent, and they'll have to import even more from the United States. The UN might have rejected Zelensky's pleas for aid, but the West has definitely taken a complete opposition to Putin's Russia in Ukraine. Many of the countries that denounced Russia did so even though their country is dependent on Russian oil and natural gas imports. Up until it became impossible to morally justify not denouncing Russia's invasion, Europe was relatively complacent. But now, Putin now has to face a completely opposing EU and an angry United States. China offered to buy oil from Russia to make up for their lost partners in Europe. But with all of the sanctions and refusal to buy any of their imports from the West, Russia will not be able to fully recover just from China's purchase of their oil. But without a doubt it would be much worse without China's economic backing. The Russian people will feel the sanctions imposed by the West much more than Putin or the Russian government will. The economic backlash of the Russo-Ukrainian war will be felt for decades in Russia, with many American businesses, such as McDonald's, ceasing all operations in Russia. The Ukrainian people will have to rebuild their homeland once the war is over. Them along with the Russian people will have to deal with the horrific feeling of losing family. There are various countries that rely on Russia or Ukraine for food, and this war has greatly affected the amount of resources being imported to other countries from both nations. Unless this war ends soon, millions of lives will be destroyed and thousands will be killed. Do not blame the Russian people for this war, blame Putin. He is completely at fault. And don't think that an assassination of Putin would end this war either. Obviously it would start a major global conflict, but aside from that it won't fix the problem. To essentially restate myself, the Russian constitution was created to give the president ultimate constitutional power. To prevent anyone else like Putin to be in power in Russia, it must be altered. I don't see that happening in Russia anytime soon. Most likely, we will not see that anytime soon unless somehow there's a sudden revolution in Russia, and that's highly unlikely. Russia's descent into a police state is imminent. Any protest in Russia is met with people being arrested, so basically what Canada is doing except everybody already thinks Russia is the bad guy. But anyways, the only thing we can really do now is stay informed. As of now, the conflict rages on, but the spirit and ferocity of the Ukrainian spirit does as well.